Welcome to Leadership Transitions and Transformations, a part of the Navigating Change series. I'm Jennifer Epps-Addison, and today we're going to delve into the intricate world of leadership transitions. We are at a critical juncture in the social justice ecosystem. Gone are the days where people are spending 10 plus years at one organization. And in fact, millennials on average are only spending about 2.5 years in any given role. When you add to that the fact that we're in a post-COVID, well, I guess we're not really in a post-COVID world, we're in a COVID era, let's put it that way. We're witnessing a significant shift in career dynamics where more people are leaving jobs to pursue their passions and put their aspirations to work. Joining us are Betsy Lynn from Beelinning Strategies, Justin Myers from Uplift Strategies and Blue Leadership Collaborative, and Sarah Audelo, the Deputy Advocacy Director for the Open Society Foundation, each of whom have navigated major transitions in recent years. They're here to share their transition insights, to give us insights on succession planning, and to talk about the role of staff inclusion and building culture during these pivotal moments. Betsy, Sarah, Justin, thank you so much for joining me. I am going to dive right in because I already know I'm not going to get enough time with y'all. Sarah, I'm going to start with you. You moved from leading the Alliance for Youth Action to joining Open Society Foundation. It's a pretty notable shift. I'd love to hear from you. How did you know that the organization was ready for new leadership? What really prepared you to transition and let go?
Thanks for having me, Jen, and with two of my favorite humans. So really excited about the conversation. So when I was at the Alliance, a couple of things. Alliance for Youth Action, youth organization. I knew that the plan can never be to stick around for a long time. One of the things that we'd always say in youth organizing is the only constant is change, and that includes as it relates to leadership. So when I started at the Alliance, I knew I was excited to lead and learn how to be an ED and, work with a great network and do powerful work. And there was a time limit. So I had intended to stay for basically 4 years. And as that timeline kept getting closer and closer, I was like, all right, time is coming up, about to go. So, was in active conversation with my board about my executive committee about what that timeline would look like, with my leadership team, and really was trying to, when I started the organization, it was significantly smaller. And we were, a time in particular post-Trump with a lot of needing to say yes to meet the moment. And just trying to think about how getting the organization ready to, be sustainable for longer term, where I be ready for someone else to come in, and take the reins. And so, it was, really scary to think about letting go of this organization as an ED. It becomes such a huge part of who you are. I know we always say that personal is our professional and personal overlap a lot. I think this is something that we see a lot with millennials in particular. But when you become an ED, it gets even deeper, part of your identity. And so to get ready to let go was hard, but I knew it was time to go. And so just trying to think about how to do that in a way that was healthy for the organization, which honestly was a lot of donor preparation, board preparation, and kind of getting out of the way. So I wasn't part of the transition committee. I wasn't part of the hiring, figuring out who was being hired next. I am not on the board still, which I actually think is a really important part of leadership transitions, is to truly create space for new EDs to create an organization that is in alignment with their vision.
Thank you, Sarah. That's so incredibly powerful. And I love this idea that you already had your horizon in, your view before you even started the role, really trying to honor, the unique part of the ecosystem that the Alliance plays. So that's beautiful. Betsy, I'm going to go ahead and bring you in now. You have had an incredible journey, lots of moments of stepping forward and transitioning out, starting with your role as Chief of Staff for Senator Hirono, and then leading big infrastructure organizations, now to becoming the founder of Beelinning strategies. I'd love to hear how you've used the various moments of transition as opportunities for both personal growth, but also for transformation in your work.
Thanks for the question. I think this is a great panel, and also echoing Sarah's sentiments around some of my favorite people on this particular call right now. So really glad to see folks today online. I think that every time we go through transitions, it's a moment of reflection. And for me, there were some very deep moments of reflection around what I wanted to do next, why I wanted to do what I needed to do next. In many ways, the transition from chief of staff on the Hill was a pretty difficult one, because you're used to being in the center of the information. You're used to being with a decision maker or a decision maker yourself on issues of the day, and every day was different. Every meeting was different. Every policy position you were taking was debated up and down and left and right, and with your consultants to your legislative staff. So that was a pretty big one. And I think for me, the 3 years under a Trump administration really hit home how much I wanted to go back to my field roots and wanted to go back to working with folks on the ground. I wanted to go back to folks who are making an impact in people's everyday lives versus what felt like spinning our wheels to uphold what a win would be in that particular political moment would be the status quo. That wasn't the case the entire time that I was on the Hill, but it definitely was the case when we didn't have the White House, and it definitely was the case when we had an adversary like Donald Trump as president and working on the Hill. That was a pretty tough few years between the ups and downs of what that looked like. After the infrastructure organization, I think the biggest piece for me was trying to figure out what I wanted to do in terms of an impact on the world. For me, that was also around who I wanted to work with, what types of projects I wanted to dive into, and what that meant on a personal basis to try to refill my cup after serving in so many different roles. And it is through that particular work that drove me to build my own company, to do consulting work to help women and people of color, in particular, emerging leaders, find their voice and find ways to navigate the political world that they want to be part of.
I feel like that's a beautiful transition to bring Justin's voice in. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Betsy really talked about like finding your why in a way through this transition, and really, focusing in on the power that we're building as individuals. And I think your journey and through transition has also really mirrored that. I'd love to hear from you. As you were navigating transitioning from CEO of For Our Future to coming to Blue Leadership Collaborative, and also, building your consulting practice, how do you navigate those changes in ways that benefit both your professional development, but also the organizations and the ecosystem involved?
Yeah, in terms of professional development, I would certainly say I've had a long career where I felt like I was always putting a campaign or organization or others first, right? So when it came to this part of my career, I literally sat down and just thought about a few things that were important to me. First and foremost being family, trying to think through whether or not I wanted to travel as much as I did in the past. I would say the second is trying to make sure I'm getting some type of fulfillment out of what I'm doing. And for me, that fulfillment in this space has always come in the form of mentorship and helping people kind of realize their own dreams within the ecosystem, and making sure, frankly, that those people look like the folks that are on this podcast right now, right? Like diverse people who can be in this space and thrive. And the third, and I think, equally important, was thinking through the type of organization I was going to, and what the structure would be in terms of board, president, and how I would interact with them, right? Who's going to be who's going to have the final say? Who's going to make the important decisions? How are we going to go about fundraising, right? All of those pieces were really important to me. And I knew I wanted to remain in a leadership role. I literally remember saying, well, I'm part of this EDs of color cohort, and I want to continue to be an ED, and I don't know if they'll have me if I'm not, right? But it was something that was really important to me to continue to be in leadership in this space. In terms of organizational needs, it's a really interesting question. Hadn't really thought about that until you just asked. But I think I did some things intuitively. The first, when I was exiting for our future, it was really important to me that I continue to maintain my relationship with my staff, particularly my senior staff that was with me here in DC, and my senior staff that were in the 7 battleground states in which we organized. So I made sure to reach out to them, talk to them about my transition, let them know that I would be there if they continued to need any type of assistance, help, development. I was going to be there for them, right? And that was also important. And I also made sure to have a staff-wide call with folks in all 7 states, right? Again, I was fortunate to have a really diverse staff there as well. And I wanted to make sure they knew that I would always have their back no matter where I was. In terms of coming into this organization, I thought it was really important just to make sure I was setting expectations up front, right? Again, talking through structure, talking through staff, talking through fundraising, just talking through processes by which things are getting done, making sure that we're in alignment, asking really smart questions. And I think all of us know once you kind of get to your 3rd or 4th job in leadership, you start to understand the questions that you should be asking. You may not have done it on the first go round. I certainly did not. And because of that experience, it made me better prepared to understand what the organizational needs could be, how I can at least find out what they are, make sure I have the ability to continue to shape them and craft them, and make sure I'm walking into a good environment that's going to be good for my career and good for me personally.
Oh, thank you, Justin. That's beautiful. And it actually takes me to where I want to go next. All of us have been through some pretty major, massive transitions, and I would honestly say transformations too. But as you pointed out earlier, not all of us have had the benefit of really intentional succession planning. So Sarah, I want to bring you in here to really talk about what are those elements that need to be in place for effective succession planning, right? If our organizations get to a level of resilience where they can really be thinking, 3, 4, 5, 10 years down the road, succession planning should be a part of that. But what are the elements that we need to bring into that to make it effective and impactful for our team?
I think it's such an important question. And I think I still think about this a lot. I think we did a lot of good things, and I think there are things I would have done differently. But one of the things that really sits with me a lot is just the role of boards at organizations. Boards will make or break so much, including an executive director, that EDs need to have good supportive boards, and boards that are looking to the long-term view and vision of an organization. Because at the end of the day, frequently it's the boards that are around through transition the most, not beyond staff. There's a different lens and role and responsibility that they have. And so I'm a big believer in developing strong, healthy, engaged boards. It drives me nuts when people are like, hey, you want to join this board? It's such a low lift. I'm look, that board should not be a low lift, actually. It should be real work. And so I think a healthy board is really important. And sometimes that means working to exit people that are not healthy board members from a board before a new ED comes in, and that being a really important role for an outgoing ED. I think about making sure finances are in a healthy place, and is there a robust reserve? We don't want funders to pull back when leadership transitions happen, and we know that can be pretty common. And so wanted to make sure that, of course, new ED will hit the ground running in fundraising, but not be so scared they might have to let go of staff. That was a traumatizing experience I had. That was not because of my predecessor, but because, when I started in March of 2017 and money was not for February 2017, money was just not moving at that time. It was terrible. Even the most trusted regular funders were all freaked out. And so healthy reserve being so important. So that way there's a little bit of breathing room. I think the other thing as it relates to succession planning as well is talking to funders. And like as a funder, I'm trying to think about like how I can be more helpful here. We had funders who came to us with additional resources to help with the transition, to help with a hiring firm, with overlap time when I was serving in a consulting role with the organization, to just like help make it easier, to coaching for the new executive director. Like I think that those are all really helpful pieces. And then, the Alliance was a network. And so having the network engaged, and the staff engaged and the board engaged in the hiring committee. So that, the three main, people who were part of that structure were part of saying yes, and having the back of who came in for leadership. The only thing I'd like name, which is related, but totally, I don't know. I just remember when I was a staffer at like lots of other organizations and experienced or witnessed leadership transition, sometimes a lot of people leave and I would be mad judgmental and be like, oh my God, new ED came in, all these staff left, it must be horrible. When actually a new leader can just need a new vision and that's okay. And actually, I think especially if we're talking about welcoming in a new leader of color, especially if there's like historically white leadership, a structure from the past, like sometimes orgs just need a new vision. And that doesn't mean that like they're a bad leader. In fact, they could be like a brilliant leader that should be celebrated. And it's okay if that means that like staff don't stick around. Maybe there's a new opportunity for staff. Maybe there's a new opportunity for board. Like there's a lot. I feel like there can be a lot of judgment that happens around transition, especially if you're not familiar with who's coming in a new role. And really what we should be thinking about is how are we like as allies, friends, board members, co-conspirators, fellow EDs, former EDs, rallying around to support a new leader, because until you've been an ED, you don't really know all that you're holding, like, or what you're stepping into. And that support is so needed, and room is needed for folks to get their footing and to figure out their vision that they're driving towards.
So powerful. Betsy, I want to bring you into this conversation as well. What are your thoughts here about how to set up effective succession planning and transitions?
Well, first of all, plus to what everything Sarah just said, very insightful and very helpful in terms of that. I would add one additional layer, which is I think a lot of the new leaders coming in who are running organizations that were historically white need their people around them inside that organization. And so a lot of what I saw going into the consulting business was really about supporting those new leaders coming into organizations who needed people who could do the work, but who understood what it was like to be an ED, but didn't want to be an ED. And I think that was incredibly important and a piece of my practice that I think has helped with successful transitions, more with new incoming leaders taking over organizations, new organizations to them. Maybe they're not a new leader themselves, but a leader of an organization new to them who needed to move that organization quickly into their new vision while managing a lot of change with board, staff, and environmental and political landscape considerations. So I wanted to make sure that that was lifted up in this conversation as well.
That's beautiful. Betsy, I feel like I want to bring Justin in and really, dig into this with the two of you, because you started off on this path of kind of what's the advice. And I feel like, all of us have learned so much. But what advice can we give to leaders about leveraging transition periods, right? How do we help them use those periods as opportunities for growth and transformation for themselves, but also how do we, set up our organizations for success?
I think there's a few things. I think the one and most important thing is figure out, who in your friend group, peer group, other leaders you've may seen in the past, figure out how you can reach out to them and talk to them about the job you're about to take, right? In many instances, they have experienced both the good and the bad. And I think if you're able to surround yourself with people like that you can speak to when you're in transition, it's never going to be perfect, right? And nothing is ever perfect, right? We all know that. But what you can do is just make sure you are getting as many pieces of the puzzle, if you will, before you enter a new space, right? Making sure you're equipping yourself with all of the right questions, and in some instances, knowing a red flag when it is like shown to you, right? Making sure that when people tell you who they are, when a board is interviewing you and they're showing you who they are, you're not just glossing over it because you really want that job. No, no, like you should pay attention to some of the things that are said in the room, some of the body language that is used in the room, and you should be speaking to your friends about those individuals and how you can make sure, or about that board or about that organization, or questions to ask, just again to make sure you're going into a situation as clear-eyed as possible. I would also say, something that was really smart that I stumbled upon is making sure you talk to former staffers. Like maybe you can't find the former ED, but if you want to try to get the pulse of an organization, it doesn't hurt to maybe talk to someone that's at the junior level to see how they view the organization, right? Again, during good times and bad times, knowing what worked well there for them and maybe some of the things that they would change. I just think it's really important for anyone that's in transition to try to find as many resources as possible and to make use of them before you make that final decision.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I'm also just thinking about, sometimes transitions are bumpy. They're not comfortable. There's a lot of emotions that are drawn into them. And wondering, what can our organizations, our people work so hard, right? Even, when they're getting ready to leave, when they're getting ready to transition out, right? That the time, the energy, the sacrifice that folks have made to our organizations is just, unmatched. And so what can we do, right? What can organizations, entities do to care for people, right, as they're transitioning out? What are some of those best practices? And I want to bring everyone into this conversation because I think it's worth saying that when people leave, we're not throwing them out, right? Or throwing them out, baby out with the bathwater, any of that kind of stuff. But instead, we're actually, caring for people in a way that allows them to let go and to transition power in a healthy way. So I'm going to bring everybody in for this conversation. But yeah, what do we do to set up leaders to transition in ways that are ethical and responsible?
I mean, I think the first is, if possible, particularly if the leader is leaving an organization in a good space, a transition document is always helpful. It is always helpful to kind of know where everything is in the Google Drive, right? To know what your senior leadership team does by title, to have an idea of which board members you can go to for certain asks or for certain resources, right? Having a transition document is paramount. I would also say, making senior leadership available to that new ED as they're transitioning in. I think in most smart organizations, or I shouldn't say smart, in most organizations, the leadership team is part of that interview process. So at some point, you do have an opportunity to meet them. But I think it's different once they know you're the person that's going to be their boss, right? So how are you getting on the ground and setting yourself up for success by not just getting on the ground and taking any and every external meeting possible so that you can show everyone that you're the new face of the organization? No, you should probably take that first week and do nothing but one-on-ones internally, right? And that should be something that any healthy organization should suggest to a new incoming ED.
Yeah, when I think about the outgoing ED too, like, listen, we as individuals become so tied up in all these aspects of an organization. You're not going to remember everything by your last day. Actually, I think it's a really helpful thing to like put someone on contract, pay for their time when it takes forever to get the credit card transition figured out or the bylaws updated or all the weedies. Like it took months to figure out some credit card transition stuff, which was, or bank account transition. It was just dumb. It was like dumb, and this stuff takes a long time. And so like, to make sure that the new ED has access to the old ED, I think it is important, but also compensating that leadership for the time, because there's already a lot of unpaid time that leadership puts into organizations. So making sure that it's part of like a budget, I think is really important as well.
I think for outgoing EDs as well, I think, Jen, you are living that right now, which is supporting other EDs that have transitioned and figuring out how to make sure voices are lifted up. I think one of the biggest things that, I really wanted to go on vacation and just go somewhere warm for 2.5 months and not think about anything. But advice that people gave me in exiting and to truly exit was to actually have those conversations with other folks that Justin referenced around like what is going on, what's going on in the landscape and what's going on in the world in terms of like other opportunities. What are the holes and where can you be the most helpful? What can be interesting around your next job and your next gig before going on that month-long vacation. I think the other thing I'll flag, especially for folks who want to be consultants, it's not for the faint of heart, and it's definitely not super easy in terms of a regular paycheck or bills being paid on time. So folks, I think as you're transitioning into things, like thinking through some of the financial implications and having yourself set up for that is a really important piece to give you the space to figure out what you want to do next that feels authentic to you and that is the right next pathway for you. Lastly, I also think the question that we always ask during interviews, at least on political campaigns, is what do you want to do in 5 years from now? That is the standard interview question. And I would ask ourselves that question also when we're transitioning. Where do we want to be in 5 to 10 years from now? For some of us, that might be like closer towards retirement. What does your capstone job look like? And how do you work backwards from there to get to that point that you want to get to? So it's a good point during transitions and transformations to figure out to do a little North Star check around what do you want to do next in life is not just next in the next year, but next in the next 5 to 10 years.
I love that so much, Betsy. And I think it's right on. I mean, I really am at a place, and I don't know, maybe it's having been doing social justice organizing for 20 plus years, or just getting to see so many different parts of our movement ecosystem. But I'm really at a place that there is a role that is right for everyone, right? And that we actually really deserve to think intentionally about what our skill sets are, what types of contributions we want to make, right? What impact we want to have in the world, and to be able to go find the place where that all really comes together for us. And the reality is that there are great organizations that might not be the right fit for me, right? But that doesn't mean that I don't have a ton to contribute to the world and to our movements. The thing that gets me is how do we give people that space? Because what I know about, especially EDs, but also, folks who are staff inside our organizations, is that they're working their butts off. They're working way over, the 40 hours a week or whatever, right, that we're thinking of, that they're stretched thin and that capacity is low. And so how do we actually give folks space to do that? And, I feel really blessed because when I transitioned from the Center for Popular Democracy, I basically had a full year of salary time, both to help transition our new incredible leadership in, and support them as they were getting their, feet in the water. But I also was given that time to really think about what kind of contribution I want to make in my next roles. And it was such a blessing not to feel rushed to make a decision, but instead to have that real spaciousness and freedom. Are there other things that we could do or other expectations that we should have, particularly, I think, for executive transitions? Because I think many of our organizations now, for example, have severance packages or maybe have severance written into collective bargaining agreements, but there isn't that same level of transparency around what executive leaders in the field are getting or doing when they transition. So what can we do to sort of create a little bit of consistency as we have people stepping out of these roles and creating more space for leadership? Not a small question. Just tackle it for me.
Jen, that's such a dream. I think what's like, I just like want to be real. I had to like go into like fall into another thing pretty quickly because of some health needs that I had, right? Like, and I'm very lucky to where I ended up and I'm like happy with where I am. Um, I think it's a question that we need to like be probing more about how to create space for folks, whether it's space when they're like on staff still and starting to like wind down their time as it. I think that's part of like what that transition out looks like. But it is, I think, the real talk of especially running a nonprofit and like some of the nonprofit rules that exist don't allow always for the most healthy, at least according to our lawyers, for like the dream of what you'd like to do with a leader. So I think we need to start getting more creative, frankly, as a sector to figure out how to get like create space for people. And especially on the state, especially as leaders of color, when I look across like the ecosystem, I think I have seen there is a difference with former white, especially white male former EDs and their transition and landing versus folks of color. It's super anecdotal, but like I have seen that, and we got shit to work on there.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I don't think that we can rely upon organizations themselves writ large to kind of set that pace. I just don't. I think it's frankly up to leaders like us, folks who are currently EDs or past EDs to kind of set that space. And I think it's a combination of us, one, taking it, demanding it, right? I also think it's another thing if we're all kind of resource sharing and making these things very transparent across organizations so that the ball can't be hidden, right? So that you can say, I know that my friend Betsy, who's at organization X, Y, and Z, when she was able to transition with some of the similar board members, was given this package. Or coming into an organization, I know my friend Sarah at a similar organization with the same budget was given this package as she entered, right? Why am I not being given that same opportunity? I mean, Sarah just kind of hit the nail on the head when you think about it. And I think all of us have seen it. White men in leadership often demand and take, right? And are given. And that has been the reality of this space, right? I think that leaders of color too should be in a position because these organizations are also recruiting us to come in, right? And sometimes they're recruiting us to come in and clean up a mess, right? So I don't see a world in which we can rely upon them to set that standard. I think it has to be us. And that takes transparency, that takes trust, that takes a lot of things that we aren't necessarily used to because we're always put into positions to compete against each other, right? I think that wall has to be, we have to tear it down and make ourselves accessible to others and try to figure out how we can make these leadership positions better for all of us and the folks that are coming behind us as well.
Whew, that was a word, Justin. You made me think of, that movement for Black Lives phrase, right? We keep us safe, we all we got. And I really do feel that way. And as a matter of fact, when, I transitioned, I didn't know what to ask for. I asked for what I think was a fairly low amount to help me transition. And it was only because I was talking to other leaders, all leaders of color, by the way, about their transitions and what they knew white men had gotten, right? White men who had transitioned recently as well had gotten, to really be able to say like, oh man, I really undervalued myself. And thankfully I had the type of board where I could go back to them and say, hey, listen, we really undervalued ourselves here. And it feels like this transition is going to take a lot longer than we initially anticipated. Can we revisit this? But that was a privilege and a blessing that so many of us don't have. And, to kind of wrap us up here is part of the reason we were able to do that is because, as Sarah mentioned, one of the things we did when we set up our transition was to make sure that the organization was in a really strong financial place. And not everybody has that benefit. And so I think that funders play a really key role in making sure that there are sustainable and ethical transitions in our ecosystem. So I think that real final question for me is, how can funders really support leaders and organizations that are in transition? What are some of those practices that would make this a much more equitable practice across the entire ecosystem? And maybe, Betsy, can I start with you? Yeah.
Sure. And I won't use a current example, but I will use an example of when I was in the Senate office and I actually ran the race. So I actually transitioned a House member into a Senate office, and that was a pretty significant transition, including leading a search for a state director, leading a search for a lot of the senior staff, both in DC as well as in state. And what was important in this particular circumstance was really trying to find the right fit to be the state director. That was what we did, was set up a search committee that committed to not only interview and then make recommendations around who that person could be, but then at the end of the day also committed to what the post-transition looked like, with helping, at least committing for the next year, to be there to help that person identify like who the key leaders were, who the key stakeholders were, making those introductions, and leaning in more than congratulations on getting the job and good luck. But like a full commitment around what the transition looked like, including sitting in retreats, etc. So like there's a significant portion that I think really makes sense to apply here in this circumstance around leadership transitions with nonprofits and leadership transitions in the social justice ecosystem, that could be done well here, and I think would really help with some of the bumpiness that I think we've experienced with a lot of different leadership transitions.
Absolutely. Justin, can I bring your voice in on this?
Yeah, can you please remind me of the question? I'm sorry.
No worries. I was just really saying, what do we need to talk to funders about? How do funders help our leaders and organizations set up effective?
Oh yeah. I mean, the easiest answer to that question is open up the books. If you get someone in the final stages and you really want them, I think it's really important that you give them a picture of the financial health of the organization. I just think so many people have walked into circumstances where the organization was not as healthy as they thought. And we should be asking, what are the current, what is the current finances, what's the cash on hand? And also, what are our fundraising projections, and how do we go about raising those dollars, right? Because as Sarah mentioned, sometimes donors will pull back dollars once a new ED comes in. I think the other thing that's probably really important, boards, as Sarah mentioned, can make or break an ED. I really do feel like in a healthy organization where the board is being helpful, they should give the executive director the opportunity to make sure they have their own board selections, right? If everything's above board, if the organization is truly mission driven and not driven by internal politics amongst the board, they shouldn't mind the ED that they've chosen bringing in some folks to be part of that board and to also help drive it towards its mission. So finance and board appointments, I think, are two things that will really be helpful for this piece.
Mm.
Thank you, Justin. Sarah, take us home here.
Oh my gosh. I mean, well, as funders, to Justin's point, funders got to fund. That's their number one job, move money. And that includes when leadership transitions happen. And we have to we can't be surprised when transitions happen. I think, Jen, what you named at the top of this, right? People are not going to try to stay at their orgs for 10 years. We're not seeing EDs stick around for that long. It's hard. It's a really hard job. I would say if you're doing it well. And I think that's some of the lessons that we've had with our EDs of color cohort that we had, is that we're trying to do something very different. We're trying to run healthy organizations externally and internally. And it's not easy work, let alone serving, for the larger communities that we're mobilizing with. So funders should not be surprised when transitions happen. Boards should not put their heads in the sand that a transition is not on the horizon. They should be asking those questions of an ED, not in like a, hey, we want to get you out, but like, hey, let's have a healthy conversation on the front end about what this could look like, about what our role as a board could be, to what I said before, about getting toxic board members out, to what Justin said about welcoming new, helpful board members in that are going to align with a new vision for an organization. Folks who have been around say, hey, I've been here for a long time, maybe I should step back. Those are some of the things that come to mind. And then especially I remember when I was a new ED and I applied for a new ED fund for my vision, to support my new vision as an ED, and I got a decent check for it. And LOL, that check went to my basic budget because money was so tight. There was no room for funding my vision. My vision, which was to have a communications team, by the way, it's not the most visionary. Didn't happen until year 2.5. Year 3 of my being at the organization. And so the other thing I would say is both boards and funders need to give EDs time and space to, especially what Justin said, sometimes there's a lot of cleanup that needs to happen for organizations. I've seen it. It's very heartbreaking when you realize when an ED is doing way more cleanup than I think maybe it can be bad. It can be bad. We've got to give EDs and that leadership time to truly do that work and then start to chart their path forward. So make time and space for new leadership, and know that time and space might just be relational, which is great. That's how we organize. We build relationships, and then give them the time to figure out what is to come in the future, because we don't always know what's happening behind the scenes at organizations.
Oh my gosh. Such great advice. Such an incredible and important conversation. Betsy, Justin, Sarah, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your invaluable insights and experiences with us. And to all of those folks who are listening, thank you so much for taking the time to really think about leadership transitions and transformations. Remember, transitions are not just about change. They're about evolution and about growth. So let's continue to lead with purpose, with adaptability, and let's continue to transform in these times. Thank you so much.